And with that, I'm going to basically wind it out in a last little bit here, is to go back to where I started. There were these inventions. There were these explosions of kind of innovation that we've talked about in the past. If you look at what's happening today, we're in a kind of a similar situation. Now, the last time I mentioned those four, the last time this happened, let's just think what was going on then and think about how it might give us confidence of what's going to happen now. The last time you saw it, you had a similar situation where you said the world was up against these really intractable problems. They had a financial collapse at that time was unparalleled. They had the Great Depression, couldn't get out of it. They had the rise of fascism, which they thought was going to take over the world. And they also had the beginnings of nuclear war. Nuclear war was essentially their climate change issue, which at the time, if you remember, was just as daunting and just as kind of perplexing to them. So what they did, though, this is kind of FDR's kind of kitchen cabinet, including the guy, Vannevar Bush, in the middle there, who essentially is thought of as the father of the vision of the web. He's the first guy to really understand, think about a machine that could connect all the world's information. But anyhow, they took the technologies they had at the time and the human resources they had, and ultimately, in the space of literally about 15 years to 20 years, they essentially figured out a way to get out of the Great Depression with a different kind of economics at that time. They essentially figured out a way to defeat fascism and contain communism and the way to kind of get this nuclear balance, which frankly worked. We haven't nuked ourselves out since. They built from scratch, a whole international system, the UN, the World Bank, the IMF, all that was built within 3 years, just whole cloth, just like boom. And ultimately, you watched a bunch of different kind of programs that essentially got that GI generation all moving. A lot of innovation, Social Security, a bunch of things in our country, but also this happened in the post-war European world as well. Crazy amount of innovation happened within the space of just a relative historical blink of the eye. And so we look back on that and we say, oh man, they solved their problems. And then somehow we look at our era and we think, how are we ever going to do that? Well, essentially, we're at a very similar juncture in history. And so what are we going to do? We're essentially facing a similar slight of like, oh my God, those same images I mentioned to you there. But ultimately, we've got even more human resources. In fact, you're a human resource thing. This is a firm that's taking advantage of this. We're looking at a situation, this is essentially college-educated people in the United States, starting in the war, essentially 1940. It says 1950 there because it's just moving up there, but it starts in 1940 and it essentially goes to today. And so now we've got 30%. We had actually less than 5% of the entire country in the United States was college-educated. Now we got about 30. In real terms, essentially, it's the difference between 5.6 million people educated with education, advanced, college education's ed compared to today. 15 times as many. Now, that's not to say only people with college educations essentially have something value to do, but it's essentially not a bad metric to understand the knowledge base of what your economy is like or your society is like. But the key thing, and the thing for your conference and the thing for this talk is, what if you would have told guys like FDR or Churchill or all these folks, and you would have said, you know what? We're going to put this thing on your desk, or better yet, we're going to give you this thing in your hand. And you can ask any question in the world, and you will get all the world's information ordered back to you in a second. Everybody would have looked at you and said, that is total magic. It's like impossible. And of course, it's called Google or whatever you want to call it, Bing, and every 5-year-old in the developed world knows how to do it right now. It's an extraordinary tool. The powers are just unbelievable in a historical context. And so we are totally able to make this transition in this kind of critical moment of the history. We are totally able to make this full move to the kind of totally computerized, totally interconnected society, one that's basically built in a global framework, which we've never been able to wrap our heads around, one that's moving in the direction of essentially a different energy infrastructure, and it's ultimately solving a lot of these questions, including these big, difficult climate ones. It is a century trajectory we're on for the next 10, 20, 50 years, but we are on it. And it starts with folks like yourself who know technology. And it starts with all of us outside of this room as well. And it is the story we're going to be living for the next couple decades of our lives. So with that, I'm going to say thank you very much for your attention. And we can actually go to the next cycle of the day. Thank you very much.
Do we have any questions real quick for Peter? Up here where I can see a little bit. Anybody?
A lot of information there.
Yeah, please.
So what do you think of all the video stuff and the Cisco stuff? You know, I would say we're not really, our offices aren't connected the way that they could be from a video perspective. I mean, we're moving to IP phones. What do you think our trend could be in the next 2 to 3 years with video?
In between your home offices and stuff?
Right.
I mean, I'm very bullish, as you see in this context, but I'll elaborate on that. I am very, very bullish on video. I just think it is worth getting ahead of that curve. I think the costs are going so down to nothing. I think these channels are opening. I think it's going to be expected of businesses. I think it totally improves the communication of meetings. I often do I'm in San Francisco. I do a lot of my European business now. I do through Skype. I mean, the Europeans seem to be more hooked into it. But we essentially, it's just such a richer experience. And I think as Skype itself is adding all these side things, you can trade, information, documents in real time, and you could do all that kind of stuff too. So I think it is a trend that is not only going to move bigger and bigger. Now, does that mean you have to invest a ton of money into it immediately? I would, it's your own kind of internal trajectory you have to think about. But I would say it will increasingly be the norm. And I think the insight, as I mentioned, I'll be very more explicit about it. If you look at where the big technology companies are placing their bets, and that Skype buy by Microsoft was a really insightful one. And actually, you've watched how Google has essentially built this Google Talk, which is essentially their video channel, which is a free way now to connect basically through the United States and Canada, but globally even too. They're all the big players. Microsoft, Google, and Apple are essentially positioning themselves for this world. And as we know, all these different devices now, including the iPad, has got cameras. Why do they have cameras on both sides? Because they're betting that essentially those tablets are going to be essentially the way you'll just constantly be interacting with people. And I think it's just, it's beyond speculation that something interesting and amazing will come in there. And whether it'll be absolutely essential to everything you do, it's hard to say. You never know with total certainty, but I would say it's past the threshold now of wondering whether people, there was all this thing, like I've watched this from Wired days, speculation of the video phone. Well, we've had a capability for video phones from, the 60s, and oh my God, we technically could have done it in the 90s. And yeah, there is that kind of argument, but we've never had the kind of infrastructure like this, the kind of video infrastructure, and the fluency in how to use video, make video, and communicate with video that we have now. And I think that's where, other than writing on the walls, look at the next generation. Anyone who has a college kid in here, of which I do, it's the way college kids connect with their parents. It's like the Sunday video chats. And I mean, it's just starting to watch how that's just baked into the way generations now, even grandparents are connecting with the grandchildren. And just watch that thing go. It's just out of the box, it's happening, it's getting into the way we work, and I think it'll be the way business is done. And so start doing it. There's a couple other questions.
Yeah.
Okay,
go ahead. Yep.
The question was, do I see a deterioration of the written word? Well, I would say, I think the primacy of the written word, I think in this last iteration, let's just think of it as an iteration of the internet, which is the last 15 to maybe say, let's say the last 15 years of the internet, which is the beginning of the internet to now, roughly, in terms of popular consumption. Those who could write, now it's like you tweet, effectively, can you do a little witty kind of tweet? Can you basically write a cool blog post that people get? I mean, writing has been the primary way to really grab people. I think that primacy is definitely over. I think it's now going to be those who can communicate visually is going to come into its own. Now, does that mean the written stuff and the written tools will go away? Absolutely not. It'll still be there. But it's kind of the similar way to think of it is think of what happened with the advent of television in the 60s, right? The world was organized around newspapers, essentially, and magazines, you could say. And then television came in. It was a goofy thing for a while in the 50s, and you kind of would watch it, and you're like, why am I watching this? And then it started to get serious in the 60s. It started to impact politics. It started to cover race riots. And, oh, my God, this thing is interesting. And once it snapped into the new formula of how video worked through television at that time, it became the dominant way that we basically communicated Now, did newspapers go away? No. Were they important still? Yes. Was it better for, books still, long form, written things were important? Yes. But where did the zeitgeist of the culture go? Where were the kind of the celebrities of the culture? Where did it go through? It went through this visual medium. And why? It's because we've been working at this for a million years. We know how to communicate face to face. No one has to learn how to write well. You just talk. And you know how to get your, lover to kind of smile, and you know how to get your mom to kind of mellow out, and just gestures, and we know how to communicate like that, and to do that with nuance in writing, it takes a real skill, and a lot of people don't have that skill. Everyone has the ability to communicate like this, and that's why it's a big deal. That's why the fundamental thing about video is it is going to democratize communication as much as it's going to allow much more complex communication in a much more compacted way. A 2-minute conversation with someone video is going to be a much richer, more complex experience than any 2 minutes you're going to get writing up 2 minutes. You can barely write anything in 2 minutes, right? Anyhow, it's a very big deal. Okay, here's a question.
In terms of collaboration and social networking, how do you see that impacting professional decision concerns? Do you see them outside of their own organization working together to solve problems, or to advance them?
Yeah, did everyone hear that question? Or it's how does do you see how does the collaboration really work with professionals inside and outside your organization? Is that what you say? I think professionals are going to blaze a trail on this. I mean, there's always the kind of, look to the young generation of how they're monkeying with it in funny ways. But I think this is really where the rubber hits the road right now. It is a huge cost for businesses to move bodies around the planet and put them up in hotels and have these face-to-face meetings, and how much time is wasted. I mean, I spend, what chunk of my life has been wasted in airports? I don't know, but it's like a lot. And I think anything that's allowing you to do very complex communication from afar is going to be an efficient business practice. And so I think there's going to be a lot of energy put into it, and I think there's going to be, in fact, you're already watching, the real breakthroughs are happening. As I mentioned there, the most sophisticated collaboration platforms are essentially these business solutions coming from IBM and Microsoft and WebEx, which is bought by Cisco, and Google tried this Google Wave. For those your technologists, you just watch it. I thought Google Wave was essentially, I would love Google Wave. My company got very involved in it, partnered with them quite deeply around that. And then they pulled the plug on its development because it didn't have the uptake that they thought were waiting for it. I think Google Wave was essentially 2 years ahead of its time, but it essentially was a tool that was trying to essentially allow much more complex interaction in real time and asynchronously between serious folks. And that will return in some form. So I think, yeah, business is going to drive this, and I think it's, as a business, just like you mentioned, you jumped into the filing, the electronically the forms, and now you got whatever, you're dominating the business. I think this is a space that I would not hesitate to get more invested in and really try to push it, because I think it's going to just, it's going to constantly open up. Now, how far ahead of the curve you want to be, it has to do with your risk factor. Do you want to try a few things and crash, or do you have enough cash to try some experiments? Then do it. If not, it'll get sorted out in the next 2, 3, 4 years, and you fast follow that. That's another way to go. But I will say, tune into this development. It's here finally. I see other hands, but there is definitely. How about in the back there? Yeah. Huh. Did everyone hear that? He was just pointing out a development which I'm not actually aware of Facebook and American Idol setting a new site up. What was the name of the site? Oh, I see. So it's essentially a way that's building off of Facebook and other technologies to kind of, through wisdom of crowds, see an emergent candidate that you would support for the presidency. Well, I will say this much. What was not mentioned in my bio is that I actually left. I essentially dedicated myself from 2004 to 2008 to essentially, I drove a thing, I was a founding director of a thing called the New Politics Institute, which was trying to help people in politics wrap their head around the fundamental shift that happened in essentially the paradigm of doing politics around these new tools. And so I was deeply involved in all that, including, frankly, rolling into Obama's campaign in 2008. And so we essentially applied all these tools to essentially winning in politics. And it's clearly kind of shifted the paradigm of doing politics in this country and other places too. I would say that same level of innovation is now being applied for this cycle. I'm not as intimately involved in it as I was that last cycle, but I would say really watch what happens in politics this next couple years, at least in the American cycle here, because there are a lot of really interesting things that are emerging in the next generation of kind of not just politics winning, but essentially ways to collaborate socially and politically to kind of get things done in our society. It's kind of in the continuum of that collaboration tools I talked about. And I would say hold on to your hats, because I think it's just really exciting. When we're just starting, who would have predicted what happened in the Middle East just earlier this year? All of a sudden, explodes. Stuff's ripe to happen. So I think with that, it's a good place to end to just say, folks, you are living in the beginning of a quite wondrous kind of period here, and you actually know something that a lot of people need to know, and so you should feel good about where you are. And but think about the larger implications of the things you do every day in your business. Essentially, also have a lot of larger implications, including at the society at large. So, good luck with your conference. Sounds like a terrific one. I'm happy to stay here if people want to talk later in the break here. But thank you very much for having me here.